I thought marrying the CEO of my company was the start of a perfect life. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and James was keeping something from me. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. The closer I looked, the darker the truth became. And when I finally found out, I wished I hadn't. Chapter 1. Light and the Proposal. My name is Lily Collins, and if you passed me on the street, there's a good chance you wouldn't notice me. I'm ordinary. A quiet girl, working a regular job at a large company. My life doesn't have dramatic highs or crushing lows. It's steady and simple. At least, that's what it looks like from the outside. But if there's one thing that makes my life extraordinary, it's my sister, Ava. Ava is my world. She's not just my older sister. She's my best friend, my confidant, and in many ways, my role model. Or at least, she was before everything changed. Ava used to be the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. She was bold, strong, and full of life, a force of nature that nothing seemed capable of stopping. When we were younger, she was the one who protected me, the one who encouraged me to dream bigger and live louder. But one terrible day, everything about Ava's life, and mine, changed forever. It was a sunny afternoon, one of those deceptively perfect days when you'd never expect disaster to strike. I was at home working on a report for college, and Ava was out running errands. She loved walking. She said it helped clear her mind. But as she crossed the street near our house, a drunk driver swerved out of nowhere and plowed into her. The days that followed were a blur. Hospitals, doctors, endless waiting. I remember sitting by her bed, holding her hand as if I could will her back to health. When the doctors finally spoke, their words shattered us both. Ava would never walk again. She was only 24. Since that day, Ava's life has been confined to a wheelchair. Simple joys like running, dancing, or even standing became memories of a life she once had. But if there's one thing about Ava, it's her strength. She didn't let the accident destroy her spirit. She found ways to keep going, to keep smiling. She'd sit by the window for hours, painting or reading, her face calm, as if she'd made peace with her new reality. But I could see through her smiles. I could see the pain in her eyes, the longing for a life she could never have again. I couldn't change what happened to her, but I swore to myself that I would do everything in my power to give her a life worth living. I started working harder, pushing myself to succeed, not for my sake, but for hers. Every decision I made was for Ava, her happiness, her comfort, her dreams. And then James entered my life. James was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he stepped into a room. He was tall, confident, and devastatingly handsome. As the CEO of the company where I worked, he had an air of authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. But it wasn't just his looks or his status that drew me to him. It was the way he made me feel seen. At first, I thought it was nothing. A compliment here, a polite question there. But soon, James seemed to go out of his way to talk to me, to make me laugh, to show me that he cared. I couldn't understand why someone like him, a man who could have anyone, would be interested in me. A quiet girl who preferred to stay in the background. But James wasn't like anyone I'd met before. He wasn't just charming, he was thoughtful. He listened to me in a way no one else ever had, and when he smiled, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. Our relationship grew quickly. Coffee breaks turned into dinners, and dinners turned into long conversations under the stars. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not just for Ava. Then, one evening, James did something I never expected. He took me to a quiet park, the kind of place where time seems to stand still. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, he got down on one knee and pulled out a ring. "Lily," he said, his voice steady and full of warmth. "Will you marry me?" For a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. Could this really be happening? Did I deserve this kind of happiness? But when I looked into his eyes, all my doubts faded. "Yes," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't wait to tell Ava. She was the first person I called. When I shared the news, her reaction was exactly what I expected. pure joy. She laughed, she cried, and she told me how proud she was of me. "You deserve this, Lily," she said, her voice filled with love. "Don't ever doubt that." In that moment, I believed her. For the first time in a long time, I felt like life was finally giving me something good. I thought it was the start of my happily ever after. What I didn't know was that this was just the calm before the storm. Secrets have a way of surfacing, and James was hiding something that would shatter my world. Chapter 2. The shadows begin to stir. The days after James's proposal felt like a dream. For the first time in what felt like forever, my life seemed perfect. I was engaged to a man who not only made my heart flutter, but also treated me like I was the only woman in the world. My sister Ava was thrilled for me, and even my co-workers, who rarely indulged in gossip, whispered about how lucky I was to have captured the attention of someone like James. But as the days turned into weeks, little cracks began to form in my perfect world. It started small, things I barely noticed at first. James had always been attentive, but now there were moments when he seemed distant, distracted. Sometimes I'd catch him staring off into space, his brows furrowed, as if he were wrestling with some invisible weight. When I asked him about it, he'd smile and dismiss it as work stress. I wanted to believe him. James was the CEO of a large company, after all. Stress was part of the job, but there were other things, tiny details that didn't quite fit, like how he suddenly seemed reluctant to talk about our wedding plans. He'd nod and agree with whatever I suggested, but the excitement I'd once seen in his eyes had faded. The first real moment of doubt came when I introduced James to Ava. I had been looking forward to that day for weeks. Ava was my family, my anchor, and it was important to me that James truly got to know her. I had spent hours preparing, making sure everything was perfect, the dinner, the lighting, even the playlist in the background. When James arrived, he brought Ava a bouquet of her favorite flowers, lilies, which instantly endeared him to her. But as the evening progressed, something about James's behavior unsettled me. At first, I thought he was just nervous. Meeting family, especially someone as important to me as Ava, could be intimidating. But the more I watched him, the more I realized his unease wasn't the kind you'd expect from a man trying to impress his fiancée's sister. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. James' eyes lingered on Ava longer than they should have, and there was a strange tension in his posture every time she spoke. It wasn't romantic. No, it was something else entirely. Ava, for her part, seemed oblivious. She laughed at his jokes, asked him about his work, and even teased me about how I'd managed to land such a catch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something James wasn't telling me. Later that night, after James had left, Ava pulled me aside. "He's wonderful, Lily," she said, her smile soft and genuine. "You're lucky to have found someone like him." I nodded, trying to push down the unease that had taken root in my chest. "Do you think so? Did you like him?" "Of course," Ava replied, tilting her head. "Why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't she?" The question echoed in my mind long after I'd gone to bed. There was no reason to feel this way. James was a good man, a great man. Ava liked him. I loved him. Everything should have been fine. And yet, it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more strange behavior from James. He'd excuse himself during dinner to take phone calls he wouldn't explain. He began staying late at work more often, and when I asked if everything was okay, he'd brush me off with a strained smile. One evening, while cleaning up his office at home, I found a receipt tucked between some papers on his desk. It was from a flower shop, the same one he'd gotten Ava's bouquet from, but the date was recent, and the flowers weren't lilies. They were white roses. "Who are these for?" I asked him casually that night, holding up the receipt. James froze, just for a split second, but it was enough for me to notice. "Oh, those were for a client," he said, his tone light and practiced. It was a thank you gesture for a deal we closed. I wanted to believe him. I told myself there was no reason not to. But deep down, I felt something shift, like a thread unraveling in a tapestry. The final straw came a week later. I came home earlier than usual one evening to find James sitting in the living room with Ava. I hadn't even known he was there. They were talking, their voices low, and when they noticed me standing in the doorway, the room went silent. James stood quickly, smoothing his shirt as though he'd been caught doing something wrong. Ava looked confused, her eyes darting between us. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice more uncertain than accusatory. "Nothing," James said too quickly. "I just stopped by to drop something off for Ava." "Drop what off?" I pressed, my heart pounding. He hesitated, then gestured toward the coffee table, where a small gift bag sat neatly. "Just something for her art supplies." I noticed she mentioned she needed new brushes. It sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. But the way James avoided meeting my eyes made it feel like anything but. That night, I lay awake, replaying every strange interaction, every evasive answer, every look he'd given Ava. The doubts that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over into suspicion. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I was determined to find out. Chapter 3. Doubts begin to take root. It started with small things, little ripples in what I thought was a calm and perfect relationship. James, once so attentive and warm, began to drift. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. He was a CEO after all. Long hours and demanding clients came with the job. But then the cracks began to deepen. He'd take phone calls in hushed tones and disappear into his office late at night. When I asked him about it, he'd wave it off, claiming it was just work. Yet, the way he avoided my eyes as he answered made my stomach churn. One evening, I decided to surprise him with a late-night cup of coffee. When I opened the door to his office, he was sitting at his desk, staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't place. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. He jumped when he saw me, quickly placing the phone face down on the desk. "Lily," he said with a strained smile. "You scared me." I handed him the coffee, watching as he avoided looking directly at me. "Who were you talking to?" I asked casually. "No one important," he replied too quickly. "Just a work thing." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. I wanted to push further, to ask why his work thing needed to be hidden from me, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the doubts wouldn't leave me. The following weekend, James claimed he had an important business meeting and would be gone for most of the day. Normally, I would have believed him without question, but something about the way he avoided my gaze as he left felt off. A few hours later, I decided to call him. The phone rang twice before it went to voicemail. I tried again and again, but each call was ignored. My stomach churned. Why wasn't he answering? Where was he? Later that night, when he finally returned home, I asked him directly, "Why didn't you answer your phone today?" He paused, his expression unreadable. The meeting ran longer than expected, and I had to keep my phone off. "I'm sorry, Lily." His explanation felt rehearsed, but I forced a smile and let it go. Deep down, though, the seed of doubt had already taken root. The tipping point came a week later, when I stumbled across a receipt from a boutique hotel tucked inside his briefcase. It was for a reservation 2 weeks earlier, a time when James had told me he was working late at the office. I stared at the receipt, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it. James had lied to me. That night, I confronted him. "I found this," I said, placing the receipt on the kitchen counter between us. "What were you doing at a hotel 2 weeks ago?" He froze, his face pale. For a moment I thought he might come clean, but then he recovered, his voice calm and even. "It was for a client," he said. "We met there for dinner. It was a business meeting, nothing more." I wanted to believe him, but the cracks in his story were glaring. Why hadn't he mentioned this client dinner before? And why had he hidden the receipt in his briefcase? As the days passed, my suspicions grew. I began to notice patterns. His late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way he seemed to avoid me whenever I brought up our wedding plans. Each time I tried to confront him, he'd dismiss my concerns, making me feel like I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that James was hiding something. Something big. One night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, a chilling thought crossed my mind. Was he cheating on me? The idea was like a knife to the chest, but I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. James was pulling away from me, and I didn't know why. I confided in Ava the next day. I think James is hiding something from me, I said, my voice trembling. Ava looked at me with concern, her hand reaching for mine. Lily, are you sure? Maybe it's just work stress. He's been under a lot of pressure lately. I don't know, I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. But something doesn't feel right. Ava squeezed my hand, her gaze steady. Then trust your instincts. If he's hiding something, you'll find out. Her words were meant to comfort me, but they only deepened my resolve. I had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And so, I began to watch James more closely than ever, piecing together the puzzle of his strange behavior. Each glance, each excuse, each unexplained absence, it all added up to a growing suspicion that threatened to consume me. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew one thing for certain. The man I thought I knew, the man I was planning to marry, was no longer the James I had fallen in love with. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Facade. The air between James and me had grown thick with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Each time I looked at him, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. The man who used to share everything with me now felt miles away, even when we were sitting in the same room. The changes in James's behavior were no longer subtle. He'd leave home without explaining where he was going, return late without excuses, and spend hours locked away in his office. His once warm and open demeanor had been replaced by a cold indifference that gnawed at my heart. One evening, after another silent dinner, I finally confronted him. "James," I said, my voice trembling but firm, "I feel like you're keeping something from me. You've been distant, and I don't understand why." He looked up from his plate, his face unreadable. "Lily, it's nothing," he replied, his tone tired. "Work has been stressful, that's all." "You've been saying that for weeks," I said, my frustration spilling over. "But it's not just work, is it? You barely talk to me anymore. You're gone all the time. I'm your fiancé, James. Don't I deserve the truth?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was about to snap back. But instead, he pushed his chair back and stood. "I told you, Lily. It's just work. Can we not have this conversation right now?" And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there, stunned and hurt. From that point on, I began to feel like I was living with a ghost. James was there, but he wasn't really there. He avoided eye contact, brushed off my attempts to talk, and seemed to find excuses to be anywhere but home. The doubt that had been simmering in my mind began to boil over. Late one night, as I lay awake in bed, I found myself wondering if there was someone else. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. I started going through James's things, not out of malice, but out of desperation. I searched his desk, his briefcase, his drawers, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain his strange behavior. What I found was more unsettling than I could have imagined. In the pocket of one of his jackets, I discovered a small folded piece of paper. It was a handwritten note, brief but cryptic. "Tomorrow, same time. Don't be late." There was no name, no explanation, just those words scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. My heart pounded as I stared at the note. Who had written it? And why was James meeting them? The next day, I followed him. I felt ridiculous, like a character in a cheap drama, but I couldn't help myself. I needed answers. I trailed him from a distance as he left the house and drove across town. He parked outside a quiet cafe and walked inside without hesitation. My hands shook as I sat in my car, watching the entrance, waiting for whoever he was meeting to appear. And then I saw her. A woman I didn't recognize entered the cafe and sat down across from James. They began talking, their expressions serious. My stomach churned as I watched them. Were they lovers? Was this the proof I had been dreading? I wanted to burst in, to demand an explanation, but my fear of what I might discover held me back. Instead, I drove home, my mind racing with possibilities. That night, James returned late again. I didn't ask where he had been. I couldn't bring myself to. But as I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, I knew things couldn't go on like this. The breaking point came a few days later. I came home early from work, hoping to surprise James. But as I walked into the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. James was sitting on the couch with Ava. The two of them were deep in conversation, their voices low and urgent. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the intensity of their expressions sent a chill down my spine. "What's going on?" I demanded, stepping into the room. They both froze. James stood quickly, his face pale. "Lily," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You're home early." "That doesn't answer my question," I snapped. "What are you doing here? Why are you talking to Ava behind my back?" "It's not what you think," James said, holding his hands up as if to calm me. "Then explain it," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Because right now, it looks like you've been sneaking around with my sister." "Lily, please," Ava said, her tone soothing but strained. "This isn't what it looks like." But I couldn't hear them anymore. The emotions that had been building for weeks, confusion, hurt, betrayal, all exploded at once. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. Tears blurred my vision as I sprinted out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, before I knew what was happening, I heard the screech of tires and felt a blinding pain as the world went dark. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. When I woke up, the world was a haze of white walls and beeping monitors. Pain shot through my body, sharp and unrelenting as I tried to move. My mind felt foggy, as though I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Slowly, the memories began to surface. James, Ava, the shouting, and then the screech of tires before everything went black. I was in a hospital. "Lily, you're awake." A familiar voice broke through the fog. It was Ava. She sat by my bedside, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. Her eyes were red, her face pale. "What happened?" I managed to croak, my throat dry and scratchy. "You ran out into the street," Ava said softly, her voice cracking. "A car couldn't stop in time." Pieces of the memory snapped into place. I had been so overwhelmed, so furious, that I hadn't even looked where I was going. The realization made my stomach churn with regret. "Where's James?" I asked weakly, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. Ava hesitated, her gaze falling to her lap. "He's outside. He's been here since they brought you in." I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me wanted to see him, to demand answers. Another part wanted him to stay far away. Before I could decide, the door opened, and James stepped in. He looked terrible. His usually composed demeanor shattered. His hair was disheveled, his eyes sunken and rimmed with exhaustion. "Lily," he said, his voice trembling as he approached the bed. "I'm so sorry." I turned my head away, too angry and too tired to respond. But James didn't leave. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat down, his hands clasped tightly together. "You deserve the truth," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have told you everything from the start." I turned back to face him, my heart pounding. "Then tell me now, James. No more lies." He took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "The man who hit Ava years ago, the drunk driver. It was my father." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The beeping of the monitors faded into the background as his words sank in. "What?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "My father was the one driving that car," James continued, his eyes full of guilt. "He was drunk, reckless, and he destroyed Ava's life. When I found out, I was devastated. I wanted to make amends, to find a way to help." "And that's why you were meeting with Ava?" I asked, my voice shaking. James nodded. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could fix things somehow. I've been helping her with her art supplies, supporting her therapy sessions. I wanted to do something, anything, to make up for what my family did to hers." His words hit me like a tidal wave. The anger and betrayal I had been feeling began to mix with confusion, sadness, and an ache I couldn't describe. "You should have told me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I would have understood, James. But instead, you lied. You shut me out. I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid you'd leave me." I closed my eyes, trying to process everything. The man I had trusted, the man I was supposed to marry, had been hiding a truth so devastating it had nearly broken us. And yet, I could see the pain in his eyes, the remorse that weighed heavily on him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said quietly. "Not yet." James nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, Lily." I promise. I turned to Ava, who had been silent through it all. Her expression was a mix of sorrow and understanding. "Did you know?" I asked her. Ava shook her head. "I only found out recently. James told me everything, but I didn't know how to tell you either." "I'm so sorry, Lily." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the revelations pressing down on all of us. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Things could never go back to the way they were. Chapter 6. Healing and Reconciliation. The days after the accident blurred together, a mix of pain, recovery, and quiet reflection. Each moment brought new revelations, not just about James, but also about myself. I was angry, furious even, but underneath the anger was something deeper. Love, the fragile, unshakable thread that had tied us together from the start. Ava visited me often, and while her presence was comforting, it also reminded me of the weight of everything that had come to light. The accident, James's father, the secrets. It felt like too much to bear. One afternoon, as Ava sat beside my bed, I finally let the tears fall. "I don't know how to move forward," I confessed. "Everything feels so broken." Ava reached for my hand, her grip gentle but firm. "Things are broken, Lily, but broken things can be fixed. It just takes time and effort. And love." Her words stayed with me, replaying in my mind as I slowly recovered. I knew she was right. Healing would require patience and a willingness to rebuild, not just between James and me, but within myself. James was there every day. He brought flowers, my favorite books, and sometimes just his presence, sitting quietly by my side. At first, I avoided speaking to him beyond polite conversation, but over time, I began to see the depth of his remorse. His actions spoke louder than his words. He wasn't just apologizing, he was trying to make amends. One evening, after Ava had gone home and the hospital was quiet, James spoke. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Lily, I know I've hurt you in ways I can never fully repair, but I need you to know, I love you. I always have." I looked at him, my emotions tangled. "Then why did you lie to me, James? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I was afraid of losing you, afraid that the truth about my father would destroy everything we had. But in trying to protect you, I only ended up hurting you more." His words resonated with me because they echoed my own fears. I had been so consumed by anger and betrayal that I hadn't allowed myself to see the love behind his mistakes. "Do you think we can fix this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," he admitted, his eyes meeting mine. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to try. For you, for Ava, for us." His honesty broke something in me, a wall I hadn't realized I'd built. I nodded slowly, letting a small tentative smile creep onto my face. "Then we'll try." As I regained my strength, James and I began to rebuild what we had lost. It wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, is not something that can be easily mended, but we took small steps, honest conversations, shared moments, and above all, patience. Ava, too, was part of this healing. She and James found an unlikely bond through their shared pain and the desire to move forward. Watching them grow closer reminded me that forgiveness was not just about letting go of the past, but about embracing the possibility of a better future. One day, as I walked through the hospital garden with James's help, he stopped and turned to me. "I've been working on something," he said, his voice steady. "I've set up a trust fund for Ava. It won't undo what happened, but it's a way to make sure she has everything she needs. Therapy, tools for her art, and whatever else might help." I stared at him, my heart softening. "Thank you," I said, my voice sincere. "That means a lot." "It's not enough," James said, shaking his head. "But it's a start." I nodded, realizing that a start was all we needed. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Ava continued to paint, her works more vibrant and full of life than ever before. James and I took things slowly, rediscovering each other one day at a time. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset, James reached for my hand. "Lily," he said, his voice filled with quiet hope, "do you think we'll ever get back to where we were?" I thought for a moment, the warmth of his hand grounding me. "I don't know if we'll ever be the same," I admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we'll be something new, something stronger." He smiled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was a road I was willing to walk, with him, with Ava, and with the love that bound us all. And so, amidst the pain and the broken pieces, we began to heal, finding hope in each other and in the promise of brighter days ahead.